You're looking at $600 worth of timber, plastic sheeting, and soil. No contractor. No building permit filed in an incorporated borough. No utility connection. The man who built this spent 11 days alone with basic hand tools, and what he produced holds 52 degrees Fahrenheit inside when the temperature outside drops to minus 22. That is a 74-degree differential sustained by the earth itself, not by a furnace, not by a monthly bill that arrives in January and makes you calculate whether to keep the heat at 65 or 62. This is not a novel idea. It predates every insulated wall panel ever manufactured. The Yupik and Inupiat men who first built across this frozen landscape understood it, centuries before the first above-ground cabin went up in the Alaskan interior. So why does almost nobody do it? That is exactly what this is about. You are living in one of the most thermally hostile environments on the planet. Interior Alaska records sub-zero temperatures for an average of 107 days per year. Not cold days, sub-zero days, where exposed skin freezes in under 30 minutes, and the air itself becomes a resource you have to manage, not merely dress for. And the way most men in rural Alaska manage it is by burning money. The average household in the Alaskan interior spends between $3,000 and $5,000 on heating fuel every single winter. That is heating oil trucked in over roads that are not always passable, or propane delivered on a schedule that does not always hold. A standard stick-frame cabin in that environment, even a well-built one, sits on top of the ground with every exterior wall exposed to wind that regularly hits minus 40, with the chill factored in. The insulation inside those walls fights the cold hour by hour. Every hour of every night from October through April, it fights. The fuel bill is the scorecard. Here is what should bother you. The man in this video does not have that bill. He is not on a utility. He is not burning $400 worth of heating oil in January. He looked at the same brutal numbers every Alaskan faces and made a different calculation, one involving a shovel, $600 in materials, and a principle that kept men alive in this landscape long before the first insulated wall panel was ever manufactured. This was never a survivalist fantasy. It was always just math. And there has been a better answer sitting under the ground the entire time. To understand why this works, you have to go back further than any YouTube channel and further than any modern building code. The Yupik and Inupiat men who built across the Alaskan coast and interior for thousands of years did not fight the cold from above the ground. They went into it. The traditional Kungasvik, the sod house used across western and northern Alaska, was partially or fully recessed below grade, with walls of layered earth and a long entry tunnel designed to trap cold air before it reached the living space. Body heat and a small oil lamp maintained a survivable interior temperature while wind drove ice outside. These were not primitive shelters. They were precisely adapted thermal solutions, refined over generations in conditions that were unforgiving of error. The same principle appeared independently in Scandinavia, where earth-berm construction kept families alive through winters that would have been lethal in an exposed above-ground frame. In 1978, the University of Minnesota's Underground Space Center formally documented what those traditions had always demonstrated. Earth-sheltered buildings outperform conventional above-ground construction in extreme cold, not marginally but substantially. The man in this video is not a researcher. He owned land in the Alaskan interior outright, had no contractor budget, and had a hard freeze arriving in weeks. He looked at the ground beneath his feet and made the only decision the numbers supported. It took him a day to commit to it and 11 days to build it. But knowing the idea works and building it for $600 are two entirely different problems. Picture a thermos, not a high-tech insulated canister. Just a cheap steel one sitting in the cab of a work truck that keeps coffee drinkable for 6 hours in January. It works not because it generates heat, but because it separates the liquid inside from the temperature outside. The earth works on the same principle, and at a scale that no insulation available at a lumber yard can come close to matching. In most of the Alaskan interior, below approximately 4 feet, soil temperature stabilizes at between 32 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of what is happening on the surface. That stability is not warmth the way a furnace produces warmth. It is thermal mass, the ability of a dense, surrounding material to absorb temperature swings and refuse to transmit them inward. The greater the volume of soil surrounding a structure, the more stable the interior becomes. Below 4 feet. That is the whole answer. Here is the part most people never think about. A conventional above-ground cabin wall is fighting the cold on every exposed surface simultaneously. Framing lumber, insulation bats, and sheathing pressed against a -40 wind that does not stop. And at every stud in that wall, which conducts cold straight through from outside to inside. Building scientists call this thermal bridging. In extreme cold, it is not a minor inefficiency. It is the dominant failure mode of above-ground construction, happening in dozens of vertical stripes across every exterior surface of that cabin you are paying to heat all winter. An earth-sheltered structure has no exposed perimeter. The wind has nothing to press against. There is no bridging. The soil does the work, and it runs for free. Walk into the bunker on the coldest recorded night of last winter, and the thermometer on the wall reads 54 degrees Fahrenheit. No furnace running. No propane line. The wood stove in the corner has not been lit since that morning. Outside, it is -22. That's 76-degree differential costs, nothing per month to maintain. When the wood stove is used, it burns approximately 1/3 the firewood a comparable above-ground cabin requires to reach the same interior temperature. In a region where a cord of dry birch sells for around $350, that difference across one full winter amounts to roughly $500 to $700 staying in the builder's pocket instead of going up the flue. Here is the honest cost breakdown, because the $600 figure is real and worth understanding in detail. Rough cut timber framing, $180. Plastic sheeting and waterproofing membrane, $90. Rigid insulation board for the hatch and entry door, $75. Fasteners and hardware, $55. With stove flue pipe and fire clay seal, $80. Miscellaneous materials, $120. Total, $600. 11 days of solo labor. Now, you will hear that underground shelters are damp. Here is the accurate version. A correctly built earth shelter is not damp. Moisture management is a single variable that determines success or failure, and it is entirely controllable. A drainage layer beneath the floor and a vapor barrier on the interior face of the roof structure eliminate the problem before it starts. The men who end up with wet underground spaces skipped both steps. Neither step is expensive. Neither is complicated. Both are mandatory. But if the physics are this clear and the cost is this low, why isn't every man in rural Alaska building one? The build did not start with a blueprint. It started with a calculation. How deep, how wide, how much soil overhead to make the thermal mass perform. Site selection came first. A south-facing slope allowed the entry tunnel to run horizontally into the hillside rather than straight down, simplifying drainage and eliminating the problem of a vertical hatch that would channel cold air directly into the living space. Excavation happened in early September, before the subsurface froze past the depth where hand digging becomes impractical. One man with a spade and a wheelbarrow moved enough material in 4 days to create an interior space roughly 12 feet wide, 16 feet long, and 7 feet at the peak. Wall framing was rough-cut lumber, stacked and notched, not precision carpentry. The surrounding earth holds the walls in compression. The joints do not need to be fine. Roof beams span the full width, covered with planking, then plastic sheeting, then a minimum of 18 inches of soil overburden. That 18-inch figure is not aesthetic. It is the threshold at which the thermal mass overhead becomes a meaningful buffer against surface temperature swings. The entry tunnel required the most labor. At 6 feet, it creates an airlock buffer that reduces interior heat loss by roughly 40% compared to a direct entry design. A licensed contractor pricing equivalent winter shelter using conventional insulated construction would quote between $15,000 and $25,000. This structure costs $600. Tool list, shovel, handsaw, drill, level. One man, 11 days, and almost nobody attempts it. Something is holding them back, and it is not the cost. So let me put the full paradox on the table, because by now it should genuinely bother you. This structure performed exactly as the physics promised. It cost $600. It held 54 degrees through an Alaskan winter, without a furnace. And the overwhelming majority of men in rural Alaska have never attempted it. Something is holding them back, and it is not the snow. Start with the code. The International Residential Code has no dedicated section for earth-sheltered habitation structures. There is no chapter a building inspector can open and work from. Earth shelters are evaluated case by case, which in practice means an inspector who has reviewed thousands of conventional stick frame builds and perhaps 2 earth shelters in his entire career is now making a judgment call on yours. That unfamiliarity costs time, and in many jurisdictions triggers a requirement to bring in a licensed engineer to stamp the plans, a cost a standard above-ground build typically skips entirely. Then there's a lender who wants to finance something an appraiser can value against comparable sales. There are no comparable sales for a $600 earthen bunker in the Alaskan interior. The appraiser has no box to put in. So a structure that outperforms a $15,000 cabin on energy gets valued as if all that performance is worth nothing, because the system has no category for it. And sitting behind all of it is plain incumbency. An entire supply chain, lumber yards, insulation manufacturers, framing contractors, exist to serve above-ground construction. Nobody has to ban a better idea. They just have to let the momentum of the old way carry on quietly, by default, without anyone ever making a decision against you. That is exactly how a superior solution gets sidelined without a single villain. So, is it illegal? Here is the honest answer, and it is more useful than the myth. No. An earth-sheltered structure built on private land in an unincorporated Alaskan borough is not categorically prohibited. There is no statute that prevents a man from digging into his own ground and building a thermally efficient shelter on property he owns outright. The man in this video has operated his bunker through 2 full winters without a single legal challenge. That is not a loophole. That is simply what the law says when you read it instead of assuming. What is also true is that the distinction between a permanent habitation structure and a non-habitation outbuilding, a storage structure, a root cellar, a workshop, is a distinction many men use strategically to begin to build legally while a permitting system catches up to the technology. In many unincorporated boroughs, that distinction is real, documented, and worth confirming with your local office before you commit to anything. The inspector's hesitation, the code silence, the lender's raised eyebrow, none of those is offense. They are friction, 1,000 small frictions stacked into something that feels like a wall when it is really just inertia. And inertia, unlike a law, is something you can plan around. The default above-ground build is not the only option available to you. It is the option the system organizes itself around first. The moment you see that default for what it actually is, a historical accident rather than a requirement, you are no longer trapped by it. Let me leave you with something you can actually do, because knowing all of this is worthless if you do not know your next step. First, check your borough classification before you spend $1. Call the office directly and ask specifically about non-habitation outbuildings on private rural land. Second, time your excavation correctly. In most of interior Alaska, the workable window runs from late August through early October, before the subsurface freezes past hand-digging depth. Miss that window and you are waiting another year. Third, price your materials locally. The $600 figure reflects one man's region and his lumber access, and your number may come in 20 to 30% higher or lower. Fourth, build the entry tunnel longer than feels necessary. It is the single highest impact thermal feature in the entire structure. Fifth, never skip the vapor barrier and drainage layer. Moisture is the only real failure mode in the system, and it is entirely preventable. Sixth, if the full commitment feels premature, start with a root cellar or storage structure and let one winter's temperature data be your proof before going further. There are real trade-offs. A sealed underground structure requires passive or mechanical ventilation. Not optional, not expensive to add, but mandatory. A wood stove in a confined space requires a working carbon monoxide detector. These are not deal breakers. They are the homework. And skipping the homework is how you turn a sound build into a serious problem. Now, picture the man pulling the hatch back in the snow and stepping down into 54 degrees while the air outside reads -22. That result was produced by knowledge that was never hidden. It has been sitting a few feet below the surface of every Alaskan winter, waiting for someone willing to use it. Normal is a choice, not a law. And the moment you see the default for what it is, you are no longer bound by it. If building tougher and leaning less on the grid is the kind of thinking you want more of, subscribing is the simplest way to make sure the next one of these finds its way to you instead of getting buried.